Greetings all you movie junkies and entertainment lovers, and welcome to another ranked video. Today we're going to be talking about the Ghostbusters franchise. Now Ghostbusters of course is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, so I thought what better time to go back and see how I personally would rank all 5 of the currently released Ghostbusters movies. Now before we continue, as I always point out with my other lists, it's important to remember this is just my personal list of the way that I would rank the Ghostbusters movies. Coming in at number 5 is Ghostbusters 2016, also known as Ghostbusters Answer the Call. This of course was the first attempt to do a reboot / remake. A lot of people got really upset by just the idea of the Ghostbusters now being women. For me, that was never something that I took issue with it. You know, the original Ghostbusters movies were all guys. Now they're going to do a remake with all women. I thought, hey, that's kind of interesting. You know, it's a remake that's not exactly the same as the original. So I actually kind of liked the idea. But honestly, just the movie itself, even though I thought all 4 of the actresses did really well in their parts, I just think it just wasn't all that great. I don't think this movie is quite the train wreck that a lot of people have painted it out to be over the years. I think it's perfectly watchable, but it just isn't particularly good. I really feel like this is a movie that, you know, it starts off fairly strong, but then it just kind of goes downhill. It's one of those movies where I can literally pinpoint the exact moment that it just goes downhill. And I actually even saw the extended cut, which a friend of mine brought over for us to watch one time. And the extended cut honestly made the movie even weaker, because it was like, wow, you can totally see why they cut all this stuff out, because it's terrible. But overall, again, I think the movie does have a few fun moments in there, here and there, but I think a part of the problem was that it was trying a little bit, I think, too much to be like the original film, when it should have, I think, just strayed even farther away and gone in more of its own direction. That's Ghostbusters Answer the Call at number 5. And then up next is the most recent entry in the Ghostbusters franchise, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. It is, of course, the sequel to Ghostbusters Afterlife. Much like Ghostbusters Afterlife, this film does a really great job of getting the balance right between old and new. It brings back a lot of the old elements. There's a lot of Easter eggs, a lot of the characters that come back, but at the same time, you know, it very much goes in its own direction. In the previous Ghostbusters movie, they had it in a whole different location. This of course brings us back to New York, but gives us a whole new villain, while the previous one brought back Gozer from the original. So it kind of balances out when you compare this to Afterlife. It kind of balances out between the amount of new and the amount of old, if that makes sense. So while that aspect I think this film does just as well as the previous movie, overall I don't think it's quite as strong. The main problem I think that this movie has is that there's just way too many characters running around. And I love that, you know, we still got Bill Murray in here, we got Ernie Hudson and Dan Aykroyd and Annie Potts and all these old characters back. But that combined with all of our new characters as well, it's a little bit too much. And there's so many moments where, because there's so many different characters and so many different subplots going on, it just doesn't quite gel very well together, and it kind of feels like you're watching like 3 movies all at once a lot of the time. And they didn't do a very good job of, I think, kind of mixing it all together into one story, especially at the end when they're at the firehouse and it's all dark and everything, and one minute we're focusing on these characters, the next minute we're focusing on these characters. It's like, wait a minute, where did that person go? And oh, now this person's here, and wait, wasn't these people just here? Wait, what happened to that guy? Like, it's just too much. And there's a lot of just characters that didn't need to be there at all. Like, you know, I mean, I love Patton Oswalt, but everything that his character tells us, I don't see why Ray wasn't the one to give us all of that information. You know, the thing with like Lucky and Podcast also happening to come to New York at the same time. Like, so there's a lot of just like, and then they don't even really do much stuff with some characters. So it's like, well, why did they even bring that character back to begin with? So that I think was the main problem. But overall, I still really like the movie. I think if you're a lifelong Ghostbusters fan, there is a lot to like in Frozen Empire. So if this does end up being the last Ghostbusters movie, which, judging by the box office results and the overall reception, it looks like it could at least be the last one for a long time. But if this does end up being the last Ghostbusters movie, or the last live action Ghostbusters movie, honestly, it's not a bad send off. It's pretty fun and enjoyable overall. So that's Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. And next up we have Ghostbusters Afterlife. Overall, I think is a really solid example of how to do a reboot correctly. And like I previously said, it gets a really good balance between, you know, going in its own direction, but also retaining a lot of elements that we remember, so it still feels like a Ghostbusters movie. And the interesting thing about this film is that it starts off nothing like a Ghostbusters film. In fact, if the title didn't pop up, you probably wouldn't even realize that it was a Ghostbusters movie. Over the course of the runtime, it very slowly starts to add in more and more recognizable Ghostbusters elements until we get to the very end, the grand finale, where it is a full-on Ghostbusters movie. And for me personally, I thought that was executed pretty well. And I was actually pretty concerned going into this, you know, especially in the beginning. I really wasn't feeling, you know, the Spengler family and their whole story and stuff, and I was kind of like, oh no, what are we doing here? This is not Ghostbusters. But sure enough, of course, over time, it very slowly it takes its time, and it does get there in the end. And overall, this movie just felt like, you know, a true celebration of Ghostbusters. And, you know, the ending especially, it was just absolutely beautiful. A lot of the, you know, sort of Easter eggs and references didn't feel too forced. It felt very sort of natural, and at the same time, it had kind of its own feel to it as well. And so yeah, like I said, it's a great solid example of, I think, how to do a reboot right. And yeah, just overall a really great fun movie. And then at number 2 is Ghostbusters 2. This is probably the most divided, I would say, of all the Ghostbusters movies. You know, some people think it's just as good, if not better, than the original film. A lot of people think it's not even close. For me, you know, I grew up pretty much watching both Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2 just as much growing up as a kid. And for me, you know, I have a lot of nostalgia and love for this film, but I don't think it's quite on the same level as the first Ghostbusters. For me, honestly, I thought it did a great job of retaining the same DNA, all the stuff that we loved about the first movie, but at the same time telling its own story as well. It's actually probably one of my personal favorite sequels ever. Some people say that you know, the first Ghostbusters movie did a better job of kind of incorporating sort of the horror and scare elements, but it's like, well, if that's the case, were you asleep during the scene where they're in the underground abandoned railway, and they see all those, you know, severed heads on the spikes? Like, did you just fall asleep during that part and stuff? Like, there's a lot of creepy imagery in this one, just as much pretty much as the first movie as well. So I think that whole argument that it doesn't do a very good job of incorporating the more scare elements of Ghostbusters, I don't think that holds any weight either. So again, it's not quite on the same level as the first, but it gets pretty close, and I think it's a fantastic sequel, and I'm glad to see that it's getting a little bit more love and attention in recent years after being kind of, I think, unfairly dismissed for a long time. So that's Ghostbusters 2 at number 2. Of course, at number 1, to absolutely nobody's surprise, is the original Ghostbusters. It's one of the most iconic movies that's ever been made, and it has one of the most signature tones of any movie ever made. I mean, just the music, the vibe of it, the look of it, the effects of it, it just has such a signature, unique look to it. Just so many fond memories of watching this growing up as a kid, both this and the second movie, and it's easily, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, one of my favorite movies of all time. And I think there might not be a better combination of horror and comedy that's ever been made than maybe Ghostbusters. It's at least one of them, but it's, even to this day, so much of the comedy aspects of it, it still works so well. I can honestly enjoy it just as much now as the first time I saw it, because it just has such great rewatchability to it. It's probably one of the most quotable movies ever made, and remains as being the best in the Ghostbusters franchise. Alright guys, there you go. That is the way that I would rank the Ghostbusters franchise. Feel free to jump in the comments down below and let me know how you would rank the Ghostbusters franchise. And until next time, be sure to consume as much entertainment as humanly possible, and I'll see you in the next video.